Yo, what is up guys, welcome to the video. Today I'm going to talk about loudness, how to make your track sound loud and how much is loud enough. When we're mastering our tracks, we need to get our tracks sound loud. We need to a commercial level, you know? We need to make our track to sound as loud as the tracks of other producers, because otherwise our track is gonna seem like our worse. And this is just because of our hearing. If we listen to one track and then we listen to another one that is louder, our ears are gonna think that this second one is better, and it's just because it's louder. So that's why loudness is important. I'm gonna divide this video in 3 parts. The first one is gonna be about how to limit your tracks without any distortion. The second one is going to be about dynamic range, and the third one is going to be about loops. So let's start with it. As I said, when we master our tracks, we put a limiter at the end because we want to reach the 0 dB and compress there the track and all of those things. But of course, we don't want any distortion. We want to limit our tracks as much as possible, but without getting any distortion at all. So how can we do this? How can we compress a lot of our tracks without any distortion? The key is the sub-bass. The sub-bass are the frequencies that are easy to distort, so we need to take care about them. The first thing you can do is to cut the sub-bass of everything that is not the kick or the sub. I've said this in a lot of tutorials, and this is going to make your sub-bass sound a lot cleaner and tighter. Sometimes I'm mixing tracks for another people and I see that they didn't cut, for example, on the leads, and they have a little bit of sub-bass. Maybe they didn't cut because they didn't hear that sub-bass, and I didn't hear it neither. But when I open the EQ or the analyzer, I see that there is a bit of sub-bass there. And if you have a bit of sub-bass of that lead, a bit of sub-bass of another lead, a bit of sub-bass of the chords, of the downlifters, of the rides, of the claps, at the end you're gonna have a lot of sub-bass, and all of this sub-bass is going to interfere with the kick on the sub-bass. Because think about this, let's imagine that the sub-bass from 0 to 100 Hz is just like a box, and you can put there the sub-bass and the kick. So you put them two and it fits well. But what happens if you start adding a little bit of sub-bass or of all the other sounds? So when you put the sub-bass and the kick, it's not gonna fit. So it's like that part that is not fitting is the part that is gonna distort. Of course, it's not exactly like this, but it's just to let you understand. So cleaning the sub-bass is gonna help a lot to boost a lot your track without getting any distortion. Also, what you can do is on the mastering, cut a bit of the sub-bass. And this is because the human hearing only hears until 20 Hz, but actually the big part of the speakers don't reproduce 20 or 30 Hz, so you can cut that. So most of the times what I do is I put a low cut on 30 Hz, so I make sure that from 30 to 0, I'm not gonna have anything that is gonna interfere on the limiting and is gonna make it distort. Because the less frequencies you have, the less you're gonna distort. So if you can cut that you're not gonna hear, you're not gonna have that much distortion. And another thing that you can do to avoid distortion, and this you have to do it in the mixing, is to limit the main sounds. I always have a limiter on my leads, on the chorus, on the bass line, on the sub bass, and this is just to cut the peaks of those sounds. Imagine that the average value of our leads is like this, but you have some peaks. So those peaks are gonna reach first the limiter. So the limiter is gonna cut those peaks, and the more you cut those peaks, the more distortion you're gonna have. So by limiting a bit on the mixing on all of those main sounds, you're gonna have less peaks that are gonna get cut on the mastering, so you're gonna have less distortion. But of course, don't go too crazy with this. What I do is I put an L1 by waves because it's so easy to use, and I try to cut like 3, 4, 5 dBs. I try to not go more than 6 because otherwise I'm gonna start getting some distortion, and you don't want that. So now let's talk about dynamic range. So what is dynamic range? It's so easy. It's the difference between the loudest peaks and the quietest peaks. To check the dynamic range of my track, I use a TT dynamic range plugin. It's a free plugin, so you can download it. And if you have a smaller value, this means that you have less dynamic range. This means that you have less difference between the loudest and the quietest parts. So this means you have a more compressed track. And what dynamic range you want for your track? It depends on the genre and all these things, but like the average value in EDM would be like around 4 and 4.5 of dynamic range. Of course, that track, especially in Progressive House, that they have a bit more dynamic range because it's like they want the track to breathe, and they have like a value of 5, 5.5. And in genres like Big Room or Hardstyle, they go a bit further and maybe they have a value of 3.5 or 3. I've even seen tracks of 2.5, but that's super crazy. It's way too much compressed in my opinion, but well, if it's not distorting, you can do it. But what happens if you cannot get to that value? If you're already distorting and you have a value of 5 or 6 or whatever, you can do different things to try to get your track a bit more compressed and a smaller dynamic range. The first thing, as I said before, is to reduce the sub bass. What you can do if you're already cutting on 30 Hz is to reduce a bit with a low shelf, for example. Another thing I do is I check the notes of the sub bass and I check the lowest note of it. So then on the Fab Filter Pro Q3, that's the plugin I use, I can see below a piano. So I check the lowest note there. So for example, if the lowest note of my sub bass is D, I check where is D in the piano. And D, for example, is on 36 Hz. So what I did is start the low cut on 36 Hz. And why? Because actually you don't want anything below that because you don't have anything below that. Of course, if the lowest note is like F and this is like 43 Hz, maybe this is a bit too much. So I wouldn't go that high. Maybe just stay on 35, maybe 40. I've seen tracks of famous artists that cut on 40. So this way, as you're gonna have less less sub bass, you're gonna have less sound that gets to the limiter, so you're gonna have less distortion. Another thing you can do for the sub bass is to compare with other tracks, because maybe you listen to a track and you think you have good sub bass, you know, you don't have too much or too less sub bass, and maybe even when you compare with other tracks, you say, I have the same sub bass, you know, but the thing is that the frequency balance is not right. Maybe you have the same sub bass of another track, but from 300 to 20,000 hertz, you have a lot less volume. So this means that the frequency balance is not right, or not as your reference track. So what I recommend you to do is try to have more or less the same frequency balance. You can use plugins like tonal balance or things like that. So make sure the balance between the sub bass and the mid-high frequencies is more or less the same as the reference track you have. So this way you're gonna realize that maybe you have too much sub bass. And another thing you can do is to compress a bit before limiting your track. As I said before, you're gonna have your track in an average volume, like say is this, and you're gonna have some peaks. So if you put the limiter, as I said, you're gonna cut those peaks. But if you compress, what you're gonna do is instead of cutting, you're gonna reduce the volume of those peaks. So those peaks are gonna be closer to the average volume. So this way, when you use the limiter, those peaks are not gonna cut it that much because they are not that loud. So you're gonna have a shorter dynamic range, and you're gonna be able to limit the track more without getting any distortion. The loops are the loudness units relative to full scale, and this is just the perceived loudness of a track. Let me explain this. You can have two tracks that have the same dynamic range, but one is like a really bass heavy trap track, and another one is, for example, progressive track. So what's the difference on these two tracks? That the trap one is a bass heavy track with not that much mid highs and the progressive one doesn't have that much sub but has more mids and highs. So probably the perceived loudness on the progressive one is gonna be higher, so you're gonna think that this one is louder. And this is because of our ears. Our ears are more prepared to hear the frequency range of the human voice. So if a track has more strength on that frequency range, it's gonna seem like it's louder. So to check the loops, you can use a lot of plugins. I use the SPL Hoka, you can use the Waves or other plugins. And on this, I'm not gonna say like an average value like in the dynamic range, because as I said, depends a lot on the track, it depends a lot on the genre. So my advice here is when you're mastering, have 2 or 3 reference tracks in the style of the track you're making, and check the loops of those tracks. So try to get like an average value of those 3 tracks and try to get your track at that value. But what can you do if you cannot get to that value? What you can do is this: open an EQ, get a wide band, okay, not a full band of from 0 to 20,000 hertz, but a wide band, put it on 1-2,000 hertz and boost it like half dB or 1 dB. This is gonna boost the frequencies that our ear is more comfortable to hear. So this is gonna help on the perceived loudness. It's gonna seem that your track sounds a bit louder. So well guys, these are the 3 things you need to take care of when you're gonna limit your track and you wanna make your track sound loud. Because as I said, it's not only limiting the track and it's not only the dynamic range. Because yes, of course, you need a compressed track. You need a track with a good dynamic range, a commercial dynamic range, you know, but also you need to take care about the loops, because you can have a really compressed track, even more than a hardware track, but it seems your track is quiet, and this is because the loops. You need to take care about the frequency balance, because maybe you have too much sub bass and this is not helping on the perceived loudness, and you need to take care about the 3 things I said in this video. And of course, if the tips I told you in this video don't help you, it's probably because the mixdown of your track is not good enough, and you need to work again on the mixdown, on the balance of the volumes, and all these things. So well guys, if you like this video, if it helped you, don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the mini tutorial. Thank you so much for watching, and see you in the next video.